Well, welcome to our fourth webinar in a series of four for our Lessons from COVID-19 grant project with USDA NIFA. We are excited today to share some more research results and to share with you some upcoming opportunities as well as we move forward. So today's topic as a component of our project is in-depth reflections on innovations in the supply chain and strategies for moving forward. So we have quite the crew today. I'm excited to share them with you. So just as a reminder, if you're new or if you're rejoining, this is the fourth webinar. This has been a short, quick project of 2 years, and we have partners all over the country. Our university partners are University of Minnesota, University of Florida, Kansas State University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the University of California, Irvine. We also have 2 centers as part of this project. This is the Center for Public Issues Education in Florida and our multi-state team, the Center for Rural Enterprise Engagement. So you'll see these logos as we move forward in the project. So this project is a USDA funded grant. It was one of 17 that was a rapid response for COVID-19. So our project is called Lessons from COVID-19, Positioning Regional Food Supply Chains for Future Pandemic, Natural Disasters, and Human-made Crises. And the project period was September 2020 to August of 2022. So we are rounding the finish line on this project, and it has been a whirlwind couple of years of research and sharing what we've learned. And right here at the end, we have lots of learning opportunities. So part of our outreach for this was a 4-part webinar series. This is number 4 of 4, but if you missed the other ones, they are recorded on our website, which is ruralengagement.org, and there's a toolkit for this project, and everything that's part of this grant and this project is there on the website. We have really appreciated those of you who have contributed to our project in many ways. We do have an advisory board, and many of you have participated in focus groups or other components of the project, and we are so glad that you're contributing to our greater understanding of how to move forward in these changing times. So thank you for being here. Today, we're going to do just a quick overview of the project to remind you where we are and where we're going with the work. Then we have graduate students presenting their research today, so we're super excited to showcase them and put them forward. They've been doing a lot of the hard behind the scenes work, so we are really proud of them, and it's been a joy to have them on our team. So they are going to talk today. The first component was part of the consumer behavior study, and this one is related to food insecurity. And we have Meredith Oglesby from the University of Florida is going to be presenting. Then the Regional Food Shed Model Project with Matthew Hockert from the University of Minnesota. And for focus groups, we've got Katie Myrie and Noah Bladorn. And Katie is from the University of Minnesota and Noah is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So one thing we've really enjoyed in this project is all of the cross-institution engagement that we've had across our team. So we're super glad to be able to share that with you and how we work together. And then at the very end, we're going to cover what some of our deliverables have been and what you can look forward to in the coming days. All right, I'm going to try to go over the project from a high level as quickly as I possibly can so that we can move on to what you're really here for, which is research results. So this, again, was about disrupted supply chains, which compromise their core function of providing safe and appropriate food to people and distress the livelihoods of individuals and businesses. So we sought to generate knowledge and resources to enhance the preparedness of the U.S. agri-food supply chains for future disruptions, but we certainly hope that those of you who are participating from other countries can gain some knowledge from what we've learned as well. So this really focused on exploring the extent to which regional food systems can effectively augment mainstream supply chains to meet the nation's food needs with a focus on ensuring the economic security of our small-scale operations. So near and dear to our hearts for sure. So overall, our major objectives were to assess the impact of the pandemic on farm and food supply chain operations, understand the capacities and structural vulnerabilities of regional food systems to support their population needs, and develop resources and strategies for current and future disruptions. As part of that, We are developing and offering training programs to strengthen support and understanding for local and regional supply chain participants at times of disruptions. My name is Cheryl Boyer, and I am in charge of the extension portion of what we're doing, and this is part of that. And so my job as a horticulturist and extension specialist is to help translate knowledge into practical applications that all of you can use. So we're glad that you're here to learn from that. Again, these are our organizations. We're spread all over the country. I'm here in the middle, and we just really cover the edges, and our research areas were in those same areas as well, except for me in the middle. This is our project team. There's 11 PIs. We've got Gustavo, you're right here, and I know your last name, and I just forgot it for a second. Gustavo Oliveira, Lee Zhang, Hikaru Peterson, Gigi, I'm going to say her last name wrong too. Somebody help me out.
DiGiacomo,
Gigi, there you are. I can't see you.
Hi.
Me, Michelle Miller, Andrew Stevens, Lindsay Day Farnsworth, Laurie Baker, Krista Court, Angie Lindsay, and Anissa Zaganel. All right. These are our 3 study regions that we have in the project that you'll be hearing more about moving forward. So these were all of our big research projects, and you can see that on our timeline here, our bar is nearing the end. So we're getting pretty close to the end of the project, and we've made lots and lots of progress on all of these different components of the study that we've been, the work that we've been doing together over the last 2 years. So without further ado, let's hear about some consumer food insecurity and resources and plans for moving forward. And I will let Meredith introduce herself and tell us who she's working with.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith Oglesby. I'm a master's student at the University of Florida. I'm in my 2nd year, and I'm actually getting ready to graduate in just a few weeks. I've been working with Dr. Laurie Baker, and this research that I'm going to be talking about today was a part of my thesis. So I've always had a really big interest in food insecurity. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for my thesis research, and Dr. Baker had shared a little bit about the AFRI-NIFA grant and all these things, I was excited to be able to add some questions to a survey to learn more about what food insecurity looked like during the pandemic. So food insecurity impacts more than 50 million people in the US and is one of the nation's leading health and nutrition issues. And prior to the pandemic, food insecurity levels were the lowest that they had been since the Great Recession. But then March 2020 happened, and COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. As we all know, this caused a public health crisis. Our economy slowed down, unemployment rates increased. There was increased demand for food, which ultimately has increased the cost for food and increased demand for food assistance. And as these food insecurity rates rose, food insecure individuals could not afford to stockpile food. At the early days of the pandemic, when people were stockpiling and hoarding products, food insecure individuals are not in a place where they're able to do that. And they're also at an increased risk for severe illness for COVID-19. Many of the health outcomes that are associated with severe illness for COVID-19 are many of the same health outcomes that are associated with being food insecure. Food insecure individuals were also concerned about increases in prices for food. So this kind of leads into the study that we did to determine the challenges and perceptions of food insecure households during COVID-19. So this was a part of an online Qualtrics survey. It used quantitative methods to address the research objectives. It was a non-probability opt-in sample of US residents 18 years or older, and we used quota sampling based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, region of the US, and income. It was reflective of the US population based on 2020 census data. We had 1,004 respondents, and data were collected July 14th to August 19th of 2021. And to measure the food insecurity rate of the sample, we used the 6-item short form survey instrument from the USDA. This is a tool that the USDA has created to be able to measure food insecurity of populations based on questions that they answer surrounding Have there been times where you wanted to put food on the table and you weren't able to? Have you had to make decisions about food versus other needs in your life? Those sorts of things. And then based on how respondents answer a series of questions, they're either categorized as food insecure or food secure. So for our sample, we had 313 of the 1,004 respondents fall into the food insecure category, giving us a food insecurity rate of 31.3%. And below is just a little bit of the breakdown for demographics for that. So we had 65.8% were white, 24.3% were Black. Overall, our food insecure individuals in our sample were younger in age, with 38.3% falling between age 25 to 34. 17.3% fell in the $100,000 to $149,000 income range. 28.4% had a four-year college degree, and 52.4% were living in a subdivision within a town or city. So one of the things that we asked respondents were what would have been helpful to you to meet your food needs during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these were some of the barriers of food insecure individuals during the pandemic. The item that would have helped them the most to meet their food needs during COVID was extra money to help pay for food and or bills, and then more information about food assistance programs or food pantries, more and or different food in stores, and increased benefits of existing food assistance programs like SNAP or WIC. Respondents also indicated that more trust and safety of food delivery, more trust and safety of going to stores, different hours in meal programs and or stores, help with administrative problems, and access to public transit or rides were also items that would have helped them to meet their food needs. So these are some things to consider as we think about the future of helping food insecure individuals meet their needs during future crises. So then if you could go, yeah. So then we also looked at the regional differences in barriers of food insecure households, thinking about their food acquisition during the pandemic. So we asked respondents if they were from the West, the Midwest, the South, or the Northeast. And so the largest percent of food insecure respondents were from the West. We had 73% of food insecure respondents from the West indicate that they gardened or grew food during the pandemic. 29% of food insecure individuals from the Northeast indicated hunting or gathering. And then the South had the highest percentage of participants that used prepared or cooked food distribution, as well as fresh produce boxes or farm to community boxes for food acquisition. And then the Northeast had the lowest percent of food insecurity among the four regions. However, they had the highest percent of food insecure respondents who indicated that SNAP, WIC, and or other financial assistance programs would have helped them meet their food needs. So then this is just a greater breakdown of what those regional differences looked like among the regions for food acquisitions and food assistance acquisitions. I thought it would be interesting just to share so you could see a holistic view of how the breakdown worked for all of the regions. You can see that the West did have the highest food acquisitions for gardening or growing food, and then the Northeast, the South, and then the Midwest. And for hunting and gathering, like I had mentioned before, the Northeast had the highest percentage, but then we have the West, the South, and the Midwest. And then overall for food assistance acquisitions, all of the regions kind of indicated that food pantries and or food banks and SNAP, WIC, and other financial assistance programs were the top for what they used for their food acquisitions during the pandemic. But I did think it was kind of interesting to see the breakdown for the other programs that were being used, such as school food programs, prepared cooked food distribution, and fresh produce boxes or farm to community boxes. Again, this is something to keep in mind depending on where you're at, like what region you're in when you're thinking about communicating or connecting with food insecure populations and what might be most helpful in helping them meet their food needs. So moving forward, food insecurity in this study definitely varied across demographic variables. There were several demographic variables that were different than what we had seen in previous food insecure research. Many times lower income individuals are seen as food insecure. Those living in more metropolitan or rural areas are more likely to be food insecure. While in this study, our respondents had the highest food insecure levels living in a town or city. And we did have a high percentage of individuals in that 100,000 to 149,000 income range. So kind of determining the best communication messages to reach target audiences and keeping in mind what those audiences may look like at different times of crisis and what are the best ways to communicate with those populations, because that may look different depending on the demographic variables such as region, age, education, income, and residence. Thinking about future research, some things that I definitely think would be interesting to research in the future are determining the ways that food insecure households adapted to alternative ways of grocery shopping during COVID-19, such as using the online ordering, pickup, mobile, any of those sorts of things. In the previous webinar, we really looked at how consumers used different sorts of grocery shopping methods to acquire food during the pandemic. And I think it would be really interesting to look at that specifically for food insecure households, and explore the categories that food insecure individuals fall in based on innovativeness. So how they're using these innovative ways of grocery shopping and determining the best ways to support food insecure individuals in using this new food purchasing technology, because some of the delivery methods and pickup options do cost money. So how do we help them meet their food needs in these innovative ways, especially during the pandemic where we were asking people to social distance and wear masks, and these food insecure individuals were at may have been at a higher risk depending on health outcomes. So how were they, what was their innovativeness and what did that look like during the pandemic, and how do we help them moving forward? So that's kind of all I had on the food insecurity side of things. I really enjoyed looking at this research, and I think there's still a lot of research to do as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Meredith. If you have a question for Meredith, please stick it in the Q&A box and we will ask it at the end if we have time. And otherwise, if we don't, we'll try to reach out and get an answer to you. Okay, moving forward, our next section for the webinar today is about the Food Shed Analysis Project, and our speaker is Matthew Hockert. So Matthew, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Matthew Hockert. I'm a graduate research assistant at the University of Minnesota. I'm a second-year master's student studying applied economics under Hikaru Peterson. So the overarching goal of the study is to understand the resiliency of agricultural supply chains across 3 regions, one being Minnesota, Wisconsin, the second one being Florida, and the third one is California. So through InPlan, we found metrics that may better help us understand resiliency, such as the regional supply coefficient and the regional purchasing coefficient. Both help understand what is produced and used within a region. I'm going to get really in depth into like how they work, how they're made up, and you know, kind of what they actually tell us. But the big picture of this study is to understand that resiliency is a difficult word to describe pertaining to economics and supply chains, as it takes on many different meanings. But in this study, I interpret resiliency as quantifying the potential ability of a sector to react to a shock. Think of COVID. So using the RSC, the regional supply coefficient, and the regional purchasing coefficient, we can understand the reliance of a region on another or the diversity of their imports or exports. And that can give us a picture or an image of how those counties and the supply chain, you know, how resilient they may be because they may be dependent or not so dependent on other regions. So I'm going to walk through the InPlan metrics and how they help with the study and the steps ahead. So yeah, the first one here is how are they calculated? So to understand the InPlan model, we split it up between production and consumption. Think of it as 2 separate entities. You have the yellow box there and the black circle, which is the yellow box is total production of all goods within a region, including the exports. So that is all of the all produced goods pertaining to any, you know, any part of the supply chain or any commodity. And the black circle is kind of the opposite side of that. It's the consumption of all goods within the region, including those that we import. So you can, so local use of local supply then is this middle section here, which is, you know, it is, it's the part that both production and consumption share. So next slide. So to get a better understanding of how they work, we can take an example. So the RPC, which is the regional purchasing coefficient, we take the local use of local supply, which is everything we produce within a region and that we consume, divided by the total demand, which is that circle. And then the RSC is saying kind of the opposite side of that again. We take that local use of local supply and we divide it by the total supply. And so if we have an example such as, we produce and consume $5 million worth of some good, and we export roughly 20 million and we import 10 million, our RPC is just 33.3%. Our RSC is roughly 20%. Next slide. So what they mean is that when you have a 33.3% RPC, 33% of the demand for that commodity is being met by local supply. That means that roughly 66% is being imported to meet the remaining demand, and 20% of what is produced, and for the RSC, 20% of what is produced within the region meet the region's local demand. And the remaining 80% is then exported outside of the region. So we can start to see how certain counties or regions, and pertaining to specific goods, how reliant a region may be, and how diverse a region may be. So as we work through these slides, we'll look at specific sectors and we'll see like how they kind of match the image that we think of for those states, and how we can use RSCs and RPCs to visualize that in a data way. Next slide, please. So for example, the dairy sector, we have Minnesota, Wisconsin on that left column, Florida in the middle, and California on the right. So the table is showing the difference between the production of milk and all its derivatives in the processing sectors across the 3 study regions. There isn't really any relationship between the study regions, but more importantly, it is to look down the columns of each one. So for example, one possible way to view these differences between these each row is Minnesota and Wisconsin. So it has a really high RSC for the production of dairy cattle and milk products, which is literally just dairy thcattle and the milk that they produce. It is the raw good or commodity. And most of that stays within the region because these are RSC values. So roughly 5% is exported outside the region. So the 95% that stays within the region is either sold directly to some person or consumer, but most of it most likely moves down into the processing sector, which is below, such as cheese, fluid milk. And we can see that the RSCs kind of drop below 50, which means that most of these are actually being exported to either somewhere else in the US or out of the country. And you can see that these other states have different levels as well, because every state region is somewhat economically diverse. And we can kind of see that the differences in this may not necessarily be a bottleneck in the supply chain, but it kind of provides a story on how these goods move through and where, if an event happens that is possibly adverse, can possibly change how they interact between one another. So we can look at the grain sector next. So the grain sector, for example, California and Florida have high production RSCs. And Minnesota, Wisconsin has a low RSCs on average compared to them, which means Minnesota, Wisconsin is exporting more processed product on average. Whereas California and Florida are actually keeping most of that within. And most of that tends to move down the supply chain, similar to the dairy, cattle, and milk sector. But an even better example of how each state or region may differ is the next slide with Florida and vegetables, fruit and vegetables. So this is one of my favorite slides after looking at dairy, cattle, and milk, in that Minnesota and California are basically opposite here. Florida, Minnesota, or Minnesota and Wisconsin has a very high fruits and vegetables, those first 2 rows in production. So most of that stays within the region. And then as it moves down into the processed goods of frozen goods and canned goods, they tend to export a lot of that. But California, being this giant exporter of fresh fruits and vegetables, it's very obvious to see that the RSC matches exactly what we would think. And the stuff that stays within the region, or maybe they possibly import some, is then, frozen fruits and canned fruits are higher RSCs than Minnesota, Wisconsin, which is the kind of the opposite state. And even though they are still a large exporter of like canned fruits, it's much higher than somewhere like Minnesota, Wisconsin. So it's kind of an interesting story about how all these different levels interact. So on this slide, we're going to kind of step away from just looking at specific sectors and see how, when they're aggregated, what the story may tell us. And so here we're looking at the RSC through the supply chain. So we have production, processing, distribution, retail, and restaurants. And again, like a reminder is that the higher the RSC, the more the good stays within the region. So we can kind of see a general trend as all states have high RSCs in the retail and restaurant sectors. So it kind of drops, it starts lower and then moves up as we move across. Some places like Minnesota, Wisconsin in this part has 27% processing, which means that most of what we process of all goods on average actually leaves the state. California RSC, as we move through the supply chain, increases as we move through it. So things there possibly become more local. And we can break these down further into how we get the RSCs from them in the next slide. So in this slide, you can see that California has the largest sectors. Roughly half of what is produced in California is exported. Lots of processing also occurs in California, and a little under half of their processing is exported. It's this big bar here in the middle. Minnesota, Wisconsin processing indicates it's export heavy, exporting far more than it locally demands. So most of what it produces actually leaves the state in terms of processing. And Florida, across the entire supply chain, is not a large exporter. It tends to use a lot of what it produces in state, or it tends to import most of its other goods. So the general trend here too is that we kind of start higher up here on the production and processing sector, and it drops down, and then it kind of climbs again into the restaurant sector for each state. And that's probably due to, we move from raw and processed goods to more of serviced goods, kind of telling a different story of how, as we move along the supply chain, goods themselves change their meaning and change how we use them. Next slide. So this is just the other side, how I talked earlier about the RPC. This is kind of telling us how much we're importing of goods. It shows a very similar story. I'll go through this kind of quickly. It shows a similar kind of trend, low to high, meaning that as we move through, we're again moving into a more locally used goods. And the next slide shows that kind of broken down again. It's the same trend as like the RSC, showing like something like California sticks out in the middle there, showing how much it imports. It's a huge processing hub. And Florida again has a lot of blue there, so they don't import very much either apparently, but they also use most of what they produce in state. So the key takeaways of this study, the RSCs and RPCs show how diverse and reliant a region's commodities may be. On average, there's a dip in total demand and total supply following the processing sector. RSCs and RPCs for each region increases in the distribution, retail, and restaurant sectors. The model generally represents what we see in reality, which is good, which is good for data. California production of fruit and vegetables, RSCs, are low. So they're a large exporter to the rest of the country for fruits and vegetables. Minnesota, Wisconsin is a large exporter of processed dairy products. And Florida is generally a low exporter and high importer state compared to the other regions. So this study is really interesting to me. It kind of shows how within states, the dominant agri-food there, and how we've kind of built our economies around them, and the vulnerabilities that we have because of these. So we have very efficient economies in this case, Minnesota, Wisconsin being a case of dairy moving down the supply chain pretty efficiently. But being a high exporter, if there's a shock outside the system where people don't demand so much dairy product, hypothetically, that would be really bad for our industry. And likewise for the other states and what they major export or what they import. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Matthew. Well done. All right. Again, if you have a question for Matthew, please put it in the Q&A and we will get to it at the end. The next section of today's webinar is about the focus groups, and it will be the largest component of what we're going to talk about. And we have two graduate students speaking, Katie and Noah. So Katie and Noah, please join us.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Myrie. I'm based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, studying supply chain management with the University of Minnesota, specifically the Carlson School, which is sort of our business school in the University of Minnesota. But I've had the opportunity to work with Dr. Hikaru Peterson in the Applied Econ department on this project, which has been a great experience. So Noah, I'll let you introduce yourself quickly and then we'll get into it.
Thanks, Katie. Hey, everyone. My name's Noah. I'm a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I study urban and regional planning and have worked under Michelle Miller with the Center for Integrated Ag Studies. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Noah. So yeah, I just thought we could start with kind of sharing a little bit about our process overall. And this kind of flow chart shows us the starting this fall, but really this process started far before that. We started with the survey that kind of assessed what was going on with businesses overall in their response to COVID, what kind of disruptions they were experiencing and whatnot. And so our focus groups were intended to really build off of those learnings and contextualize those findings within stories. So Matthew kind of gave us an amazing overview of what's happening on a resilience spectrum with the mathematical perspective. And we really looked for the stories that, the business experiences, how they responded, what strategies worked, what strategies could be carried forward, those kinds of things. So with the survey learnings, we started to get really curious about labor, market channels, different pivots that businesses made, as well as supplier channels or supplier challenges. So what we did is we took those areas of interest and we designed focus group questions that really allowed us to explore those questions a little bit deeper than what the survey results could provide. So we built out our session protocol, which I'll go over in just a minute here. I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about how we recruited these participants too. So some of these participants that we invited to participate in our focus groups had already filled out the survey in the earlier survey as part of this overall project. So we invited those participants who were interested and willing to come back into the focus group setting and share a little bit more context. We needed more participants though, so we recruited out in a variety of methods. Just to kind of invite you into how we did that, we sent out email, like listserv invitations. We tapped our research partners in all of our regions, as well as reaching out to regional business associations and personal and professional connections, I should say. So that work kind of occurred over the fall and winter of this past year, and then it culminated in our efforts to host these focus groups between February and then early April. So we hosted a total of 50 participants through 11 focus groups, and these focus groups were 90-minute Zoom sessions, and the participants that we hosted were compensated for their time. So they were paid $100 to share their experience and their insights during those sessions. And then finally, now we're in the stage where we're analyzing the data. So Noah's taking the lead on that, and he will share later this afternoon about how he's structuring that work. So who did we target for this? We found participants, again, through the same three regions we've been mentioning today. Our approach was really the same as Matthew mentioned, where we were going from production to processing, distribution, retail, and restaurants. So you can see the colors there are broken out across those categories. And our goal was to target, a broad cross-section of participants across these different segments of the supply chain, as well as regions. So we wanted to have a mix of representatives from each region and from each segment. The other piece I'll mention is we also wanted to have different sizes and scales of businesses. So we made efforts to, try to get the bigger companies and the bigger farmers into the room, as well as the early stage or the small farmers. Let's see. Yep, so questions and yeah, you can go ahead, thanks. So our intent with these focus groups was to keep them very conversational and brainstorming in nature. And we found that the participants really enjoyed being in the room together. A lot of small scale farmers have never been in the room with, for example, a large flour miller or a large retail aggregate grocery retailer company. So it was really a positive experience, I would say, for a lot of participants. And we really kind of set up our protocol in a way that tried to get participants to talk to each other, agree and disagree, and share more information. We found that most of our participants were really open. That was really a positive part of it. So these are kind of the 6 areas that we focused our interests in for these focus groups. And we'll talk a little bit more about examples from each of these categories in a few minutes. We can start out with size and scale. So we were really interested in, whether or not a business's size could really affect their ability to get supplies, to pivot to different market channels, or generally exert some kind of influence in their market positioning. So we had great conversation related to that. We were also really interested in sort of the relationships that these businesses might have had with their upstream or downstream partners. COVID for many businesses, brought them closer to their suppliers or created rifts within their suppliers. They might have changed products. So we were really interested in what was going on at that level. Labor is obviously, always an issue in the food industry. And there's a lot of interesting and challenging aspects of COVID related to labor supply. So we talked a lot about that in our focus groups as well. Regionalization, which is why, we're all here. This is a big question. We asked folks to kind of describe how they might be changing their business strategy based on their geographic scope. So this primarily had to do with, are you bringing your suppliers closer geographically to your business? Are you paying more attention to how you're sourcing from a diversity of geographic regions? Or, what would it look like to have a regionally resilient supply chain? So this sparked really interesting conversation as well. The last 2 were government and professional networks. We asked folks about, what the government did to support them or didn't, or what they could do going forward, as well as the role of professional networks in facilitating some of the strategic pivots or the support that those businesses needed during COVID. So overall, with these questions, what we did as an approach was we spent a little bit of time looking backwards. So we asked businesses to reflect on what happened during COVID and what they did and how they responded to different challenges. So as an example of what we asked in the question of size or scale was, how did business size provide either advantages or disadvantages to your business during COVID? So we spent some time allowing businesses to reflect on questions like that. And then the second half of our sessions, we tried to get them to look ahead. So we tried to get them to talk a little bit about what their plans are going forward and what kind of measures for resiliency they're going to employ in the future. So with that, I'll hand it off to Noah, who's going to kind of share some of our results from this work.
Great, thanks, Katie. As Katie was saying, so we've conducted these focus groups over the last 2 months and are just starting to dig into the data. We've had some initial thoughts and responses to the different responses that we're getting in these focus groups. And kind of as Katie was saying, we've got some really rich data to work with. So we're starting to develop out the different codes and finding different trends and results throughout these focus groups. So relating to size and scale, what we're hearing from the focus group is that at all scales throughout the industry, people are seeing pros and cons to their own position within the food system. So for example, small businesses highlighted the importance of being nimble and flexible and being small and being able to act quickly and make adjustments during the pandemic to respond to whatever issues that they were facing at that time. But they also mentioned struggling with larger access to systemic barriers, such as like finding things like PPE or plasticware as the industry sort of shift in terms of needs. On the other hand, we saw large businesses highlighted their access to policymakers and access to physical infrastructure such as distribution centers and fleets as their strengths within the food system compared to the smaller businesses. But kind of conversely, they discussed the difficulties with being able to act quickly. And I'll discuss this later, but a great example of that is their issue dealing or their ability to deal with the issue of labor needs. But yeah, let's keep moving forward and we can discuss that later. So yeah, next we can discuss relationships within the supply chain. So during the pandemic, retailers realized the importance of different things within the supply chain. One of the most important things that people talked about across the food chain was limiting SKUs and prioritizing consistency from their suppliers. So I think a lot of people talked about the culture in America of, having 30 different options when you're inside the grocery store. And during COVID, what was most important was keeping the shelves full as opposed to keeping options diverse. So limiting SKUs was like a major thing across all sort of like retail levels in the food chain. So also at all levels, there was more of a reliance on local, regional, and direct sources. So shortening the supply chain was sort of essential. You could like rely more, especially sort of at the smaller and mid-sized scale, you could rely more on local farmers in that direct supply chain than these like large national or international scales. Even on small levels, we talked to businesses that were importing goods from places like Italy or Greece. And as those governments shut down, they couldn't rely on those imports anymore. Also, sort of more at the smaller scale, when supply dried up, businesses relied on sort of non-conventional sources for businesses, so like Amazon or big box retailers to find their supplies. We also saw that at the same time, large suppliers were dropping small businesses. So small businesses that had relationships with large distributors like Cisco were getting dropped after years of working together, and just now they're in discussions of being picked back up again. So what we heard from this is there's a demand both for social and physical infrastructure to strengthen supply chains at all levels, both local, regional, and national. And that diversity in your relationships and having these direct relationships are important to creating sustainable food chains. So next, we'll look at labor supply, and this was a really rich aspect of our discussion. Both in the surveys and the focus groups, this was one of the major topics that people talked about. As Katie kind of foreshadowed, labor is consistently an issue within food systems, and it was exacerbated by COVID-19. So yeah, we heard that finding labor was and continues to be a major issue for the industry. Large-scale farms relied heavily on H-2A labor to keep up with their sort of fluctuating schedules and demand for labor. This was reliable for them during COVID, but only larger scale farms had access to this sort of labor. So we saw that like demand for labor kind of fall down the supply chain to smaller and mid-scale farms that couldn't apply for that program. What we're also hearing is that most people were increasing pay and benefits to attract and retain workers. Here, the smaller businesses could act more nimbly, offer pay raises quicker, and we even heard cases where limited pay raises or limited time benefits were offered Whereas at sort of larger scale businesses, there were a lot of bureaucratic barriers to having this sort of nimbleness to attract new workers. Many businesses blame the government for being a competitor in the labor market, is sort of how they framed it. So this has to do with increased unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, and other benefits that citizens received during COVID-19. A lot of businesses just cite the government as being a barrier to them hiring new people. And then another issue we heard that persists to this day is an issue finding contractors, trucking labor and skilled labor as a sort of labor issue has been exacerbated. Kind of going away from this looking backward and looking forward questioning, some questions were just related to looking forward. So COVID-19 was seen as an opportunity for growth and change for some businesses. And this kind of had a diverse response. So some businesses were well positioned during COVID-19 for the pandemic. On a small scale, that may look like a U-Pick farm, a CSA farm. We had some respondents who had more delivery-focused restaurants, so like pizza parlors and examples like that, that were just well positioned for the pandemic, saw sales increase, were able to retain their employees, and a lot of them even experienced growth. Another segment of this population were businesses that completely changed their structure during the pandemic. So a good example was a business in Minnesota, was previously set up as a brick and mortar operation, but switched their operation to be entirely through e-commerce. And through this, they were kind of able to reimagine themselves and regrow during the pandemic. So this kind of represented an opportunity for growth and change. A lot of people also just talked about developing websites and delivery systems during this time that may have been planned in the past, but COVID was kind of that initiating factor. And then an interesting thing that we also heard back from businesses was that COVID kind of revealed things about their businesses, maybe inefficiencies or issues within work culture that COVID kind of forced them to take head on. And so we had an interesting quote that someone was just saying that like COVID revealed to us who we were and has positioned us better for things like pandemics or other crises in the future. So that was sort of interesting. I'll pass this to Katie real quick. She'll talk about geographic scope.
Yeah, so I think, a big question why a lot of us are here today is to explore this question, right? What do we need to do to regionalize our supply chains to make them more resilient? The question that we posed was a little bit broader than that. And at the same time, it was specific to the business itself. So, we asked folks, would geographically regionalizing your supply chain, help avoid some of these challenges that Noah's outlined in the previous slides? What we got was actually a wide range of responses that helped us realize that geographic diversity is just one component of a resilient supply chain. And in fact, a lot of folks said that they were really interested in regionalization, and then they expressed it as sort of this return to regionalization, restoring some of the resilience that we've already had in our supply chains. So a lot of folks spoke to this phenomenon from kind of a values-driven perspective, which a lot of us, I'm sure, can relate to. But those who were sort of critical of this idea of regionalization pointed to some disruptions beyond COVID-19 that we've experienced in the past few years. So I think that there's, we frame this question in bringing your suppliers closer to your business. But, a few folks said things like, well, what if there's a natural disaster? What if we aren't able to produce our own food? Specifically, someone from Florida said, what if disasters strike? We won't be set up for products. So there's clearly a need to point to, past experience where, hey, I remember when we were in a crisis, we weren't able to produce our own food and we had to rely on someone else. So this interconnectedness across regions is really, really important. And there's some fear in regionalizing on a 100% basis. This was echoed in a comment from a company in the bottom box here who said, you know, when the ice storms hit Texas, we had significant disruptions to our facilities. So we had to rely on other regions in being able to kind of counteract some of that disruption by providing supply to that region during those times. But there's a lot of different dimensions we can talk about regionalization. You know, some of these companies are importing products from around the world, and you know, a lot of folks said that this has given them an opportunity to evaluate whether or not they want to shorten those supply chains and shore up some of that production here in the U.S. And again, you know, even farmers have a variety of inputs that they rely on, from fuel to equipment, and it can be very hard for some businesses to, you know, consider what it would be like to get all the things that they need and buy. They need to buy for their farm. I will say that, you know, the idea of risk mitigation is a really big piece of this, and I will say that one thing that I noticed was a lot of organizations and businesses, you know, really mentioned having a closer relationship to not only their suppliers, but their suppliers' suppliers. So they're certainly thinking about this regionalization question, perhaps not from can I source locally framework, but maybe a little bit more from how can I be more connected to my supply chain, to be more aware of potential challenges that might emerge that will affect me a few chains or a few segments down on the chain that I need to pay attention to now. So I think that, you know, is evidence of us moving towards a more regionalized approach, but we'll have to, you know, see how these businesses respond.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so moving forward, obviously the government played a major role during the crisis, and we heard a lot of response from our participants on both their feelings and sort of the outcomes that different government programs or mandates, how they affected them. So this was split into two different segments, both programs and kind of government relations. So in the programs, the PPP was something that was discussed pretty deeply within our focus groups. A lot of businesses that we talked to benefited from PPP loans and kind of cited it as a reason that they were able to stay afloat during the crisis. So these sort of government interventions were seen as helpful. And what we heard is that the easier it was to sign up for these programs, whether state, local, or national, the better these programs were received. And then, as discussed before in the labor section, there were some negative sort of responses to government intervention in regards to labor. People saw them as a competitor in the labor market force. And then also, depending on regions, businesses responded to government mandates differently. Specifically within the survey, participants discussed it didn't necessarily matter what the mandates were. What they were looking for was consistency. So any issue with government mandates going back and forth, whether like reopening and closing down again, those represented issues for their businesses. And finally, we'll wrap up with the role of professional networks. This was sort of a forward-looking discussion that we had. Across size and scale, people sort of highlighted the importance of networking during times of crises. A lot of businesses, as discussed before, changed their business structure, and were able to do this because of either existing professional networks that they had or networks that they were able to create during COVID. I think really good example also comes from Minnesota. The Central Kitchens program sort of allowed companies, specifically restaurants and catering companies that otherwise would have been shut down, to repurpose and continue making meals for the community and continue their revenue streams going. So I think that was a good example of what sort of innovative professional networking could look like. And what we heard from people is that there's sort of this need for this social infrastructure to facilitate and create professional networks throughout the food chain. So it was actually really interesting too within the focus groups. Many of them ended with people exchanging emails and trying to stay in contact with each other despite, being at different scales or in different regions. It's really important for people to talk about these issues that we went through and work together to kind of creating a better food system moving forward. So finally, we'll wrap up just talking about the next steps of what we're looking through. Right now, we're sort of just diving into this data. It's really rich. We've had 10 focus groups, 90 minutes each, so there's a lot to take in. We've done this sort of initial memoing, looking at what are the main takeaways, what are our biases as researchers, and where are the outliers within our data. And we're taking that, we're beginning to code. So what are kind of the themes? What are the major takeaways? And what are we missing? What are, we sort of pre-categorize these topics, but maybe new topics were introduced that were on people's minds as well. And from there, we're hoping to discover trends from this data. So looking across regions, size and scale, what are people saying? What were their major issues during COVID? What worked well, and where people are prescribing we should go next to better prepare ourselves in times of crises and normal times as well. So thank you all. I know that was a bit of a long presentation, but this is really exciting stuff, and I think we've all enjoyed working on it. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Katie and Noah. And it is a lot. So this was our first time to sort of begin to pull it together. So it'll be exciting to see how we compile and publish it. And we'll be sure to share that on the website as those papers are published. So you can keep checking back to find that. So speaking of the website and project outputs, we do have a couple of exciting things to share with you, more than a couple actually. The link is in the chat if you scroll up just a little bit, but we have some new fact sheets for this project. So they're really, really interesting. We've got one on household roles and time spent shopping, prepping, and eating food during COVID-19, extension programming recommendations based on concerns of food acquisition during COVID-19, and permanent closures in the food supply chain due to COVID-19. So I think there's maybe one or two others, and you can find those on our website. So check those out. The other things we have coming up, this is the last webinar of the series and the recordings are all available. This one will be up probably tomorrow, and I'll send an email to everyone who registered soon as we've got it available, so you can go check it out and watch that. In 2 weeks, coming up quick, we have a Train the Trainer conference. It is online, it is synchronous at the same time, and it's midday for the whole country. So we'd love to have you join us. We also have a link for that, and you can find it on the website. There's also a short URL coming up here in just a minute to get you to that. And after that, we'll have an online course that will be asynchronous, so a little bit more on your own time, but we'll have office hours with project investigators. And hopefully we plan to be working on that over the summer and have it ready to launch in August, just before the end of the project timeline. So be looking for those things. We would love to have you as a part of the applied portion of what we've learned. And thank you so much for learning with us. The short link for the conference is there. It's bit.ly/COVID lessons conference, or you can find it on rural engagement. And we don't have very much time for questions, maybe possibly one, maybe not. I think most of the questions have been answered in the chat by my colleagues. But if you have a direct question, you're welcome to reach out to any of us. We're all on the website. But there are some easy ones for you to pick from if you want to ask us some questions. And then with that, we will see if there's anything else you all would like to talk about real quick, and we'll plan on ending right on time to respect your 1-hour commitment to our webinar. So Laurie, is there anything I haven't seen in the chat that you want to share about? If not, thank you all so much for joining, and we will see you again soon. Thanks.